Thank you very much, Pranav. In fact, you're the first guy who's actually introduced me by beginning to say he doesn't need an introduction and actually managed to summarize everything in a couple of sentences. Normally, they say he doesn't need an introduction and then they proceed to spend 10 minutes introducing you, which makes it necessary for you then to give an equally long speech to justify the length of the introduction. And I really prefer to belong to the Elizabeth Taylor School of Public Speaking. You know, as Elizabeth Taylor said to her husbands, "I shall not keep you long." That's my... That tends to be my preferred philosophy, but then there's a reason for that today, because I really do want to have an interaction with those of you who want to ask questions as well. So I'll say a few things and I hope to provoke you. I mean, I've spent an hour actually being grilled by the students and some members of the faculty in a very lively interactive session just before this, so maybe a bit ragged in voice, but I hope that you will still have some questions to ask me. But anyway, it's great to be here with these well-regarded, distinguished alumni. Enjoyed listening to Dean Rangnekar express such genuine and heartfelt praise of all of you and what you've accomplished and therefore what you've made of the school, because you really have, I think, created a generation not just of managers, or you epitomize a generation of managers who are also going to be leaders of the new India of the 21st century. And it's terrific to have so many of you here. I mean, I come from an academic background that is devoid, blissfully perhaps, or maybe not so blissfully, of any formal education in management theory. Unlike my good friend Pallam Raj, who actually has an MBA and brought it to government, but I don't, I have to admit. But as Pranav mentioned, my years at the UN, the truth is that managing the largest department of the UN Secretariat with some 800 staff in over 80 offices around the world, some of which I had to close for budget reasons, a shrinking budget, and of course political pressures to prune overheads and so on. I sometimes felt I kind of earned an MBA on the job. So even though you don't really formally receive an MBA at ISB, for reasons that can only be described as petty and bureaucratic in our system, there's no question that ISB is still, thanks to all of you, your outstanding faculty, your dean, and above all you, the alums, ISB is recognized as one of the best management institutions in Asia, so the three letters don't really matter. Now, Dean Rangnekar spoke about 150 years of management education. That threw me a bit because my research only establishes management studies going back to the early years of the 20th century, when they had first got accounting and bookkeeping courses in this rapidly industrializing society of the US. And so they took the standard American 2-year postgraduate program and they got more students to enroll right after taking a first degree. And then the Model 1 acceptance as the US economy boomed. And that's why the Wharton Business School started in 1881, which is what? Oh, you're right, it's 133 years. So close to a century and a half. And then, of course, the world's first undergraduate business school was the Tuck School of Business at Dartmouth, which was founded in 1900. So you actually, I beg your pardon, Wharton was the first undergraduate school and Dartmouth was the first graduate school. And then the Harvard Business School became the first in 1921 to offer a full-fledged MBA degree. And in India, we had the Indian Institute of Social Welfare and Business Management in 1953, which I think was the first Indian institution that taught management. And then when the Planning Commission wanted to set up management institutions here, they consulted a man called Dean Robbins of the University of California, and he set up the first IIM in Calcutta in 1961. Then came the Ahmedabad IIM, and then you know the story. So in some ways, if you go back to this Indian Institute of Social Welfare and Business Management, last year was sort of the Diamond Jubilee, the 60th anniversary of management education in India, which means you guys belong to the post-diamond phase. I hope that's a good excuse when the lady in your life wants diamonds, right, for the males in this room. But anyway. Now, what the IIM calls the PGDM and you guys call the PGP and so on has clearly evolved over the years. It isn't the same degree that was offered earlier. The skills imparted, the academic rigor that you all require, I think no longer just prepares you for life in the corner office, but for life itself in the broader sense. And interestingly enough, more and more business graduates appear to be venturing into unconventional careers, not just the corporate offices that business degrees initially prepared people for. Pallam, as I mentioned, in politics, others in NGOs, some in quite extraordinary entrepreneurial ventures that have taken them away from some of the more sort of corporate orientation of business studies. But I would argue that your education should give you a better understanding of the processes across many sectors of not just markets, but of our economy as a whole. And that ultimately befits you for doing different things. And of course, our country is increasingly becoming entrepreneurship driven. I don't know if you fully agree with that, and we can certainly disagree about how far we're heading down that model. But there's no questions, because after all, when Indians went off from a very closed Indian economy to places like Silicon Valley, they went off and proved themselves as entrepreneurs by establishing institutions. So there was nothing wrong with Indians once they got abroad. It was simply that our system here had not encouraged entrepreneurship. And I would argue that as the student who picked me up at the airport, Ridhiman was saying, will you talk about leadership? I said, what you're doing is actually leadership. What is management? It is a process of studying about the process of leadership. And that's why in some ways I wonder whether I did the right thing. When I cleared St. Stephen's in Delhi, I took the entrance exams to both the IIMs that existed in the country at that time, Calcutta and Ahmedabad. And I managed to come first in one and second in the other. And then I turned them down to go off and study international affairs in the States. And I thought that was because the only choice available to IIM graduates in those days was selling detergent and an equivalent for a multinationalized, a Hindustanized multinational. But the truth is, I was making this choice in a very different national environment. Our economy was closed, it was socialist, it was protectionist, international exposure was limited. I thought I really had to go and study international relations abroad if I wanted to be open to the world. But today the world has become smaller, we have become more globalized, opportunities are greater for all of you, and today's graduates, of course, have a wide variety of choices that were not available to my generation or Pallam's. Now, that is why I would argue that we're becoming more entrepreneurial, because more people with that mindset are coming into the system, are growing into it. In fact, I was proud to helm a program in the Technopark in my constituency, Thiruvananthapuram, called I Am an Entrepreneur, that actually gives incentives for people who want to start entrepreneurship work. And it represents how dramatically India has changed since liberalization began in '91. In many ways, the diversity of our economy has enabled us to weather the storms created by the global economic crisis of '08. You know that we are already in nominal terms the 10th largest economy in dollar terms in GDP in the world. And even that, I privately have to admit, is an undercount, because our black economy is so large that if we added that, our GDP would be even larger, right? I mean, so, and then if you convert that in purchasing power parity terms, PPP, then we are now the third largest economy. We've overtaken Japan, and they're behind only the US and China. But more interesting than those brute numbers is actually our demography. Because at a time when, sort of, if you look at China and Japan and Korea and so on as the big Asian rivals, we actually have a better demographic dividend potential than any of them, let alone any of the advanced developed countries. Of our 252 billion population, in fact, a little over 50% is under 25, and 65% are under 35. So in fact, since most alumni of ISB probably fall in that 65 category, you guys are a majority in the country and not just in this auditorium. We are, in other words, a young country at a time when the rest of the world, including China, is aging. I promise you I won't inflict too many numbers on you during this talk, but some that are worth mentioning right away. The ILO, the International Labour Organization, has predicted that by 2020, India will have, if you look at the sort of work starting age group of 20 to 24 years, we will have 116 million workers between 20 and 24. 116 million, whereas China will have dropped down to 94 million, right? The average age in India in that same year, 2020, will be 29 years. In the US, young, thriving, entrepreneurial US, it'll already be 40. In Europe, it'll be 46. In Japan, it'll be 47. If you look at projections for the labor force in these countries in the next 20 years, it'll decline by 4% across the industrialized world. It'll decline by 5% in China, thanks to the success of their one-child policy. And in India, it will increase by 32%. Now, this demographic dividend only works as an advantage for us if we, of course, can educate and train our young people to seize the opportunities that the 21st century offers them. Because otherwise, this demographic pattern that I've described to you will not be a demographic dividend, but a demographic disaster. Why? Because, frankly, the single most dangerous thing for our society, and probably for any society of a developing country facing intractable issues at home, the single most dangerous thing is having a legion of uneducated or undereducated, unemployed and unemployable, and therefore frustrated young men. I exempt, by and large, the women from this charge, but they are the ones who make up the rioters, the insurrectionists, the Maoists in Dantewada and places like that. These young men are the cannon fodder who are recruited by the dangerous ideologues, because since they have no stake in our society or our economy, because they have no hope in it, $1,000 and a gun seems to offer them something more meaning, some greater meaning in their lives. So we have to educate the young people everywhere. Those who don't want a conventional education, we have to equip them with skill training. And this has got to be a national security. I've often argued when I was in HRD ministry with Pallam, I would often argue education and training are not just socio-economic issues. It's a national security issue. Because the biggest, largest internal threat to our country, according to then Prime Minister Manmohan Singh, is the Maoist insurrection. Do we want to replicate that across the country? Which we will if we fail to educate or train our people. So I used to challenge the private sector whenever I had an opportunity to speak at FICCI or whatever. Set up more training institutions, set up vocational training institutions. Why should a country of 1.2 billion people have a nationwide shortage of certified masons, of certified plumbers? Because all the ones with quality certificates or diplomas are sitting in the Gulf making larger money than you can pay them. Well, train more. The need is there. And the fact is that if we had to argue this issue, harnessing young India's potential, this demographic bulge I described to you, obviously requires people like you, a pool of highly educated, exceptionally motivated individuals to provide leadership across all sectors of the economy. That's why I accepted Dean Ragnekar's invitation to come and address the alumni of ISB today, because I expect to charge you with the responsibility of leading this wherever you are in your post-ISB life. The fact is that, we can celebrate the quality of this institution. It's definitely adding to its own luster through your own success and the various other good management schools which have helped contribute to the building of brand India in our country. We still have to acknowledge that we tend to judge them by whether they're featuring in global rankings and so on, which most Indian business schools still don't, though ISB has been doing better than most. But it's a question of how you all can transform the India, the real India into which you enter equipped with that PGP degree or diploma or certificate or whatever it is that you get when you leave ISB. In 66 years of our independence as a nation, we have actually found some pretty impressive creative solutions to our problems. I'm not one of those who accepts the rhetoric of politicians who say that everything is bad, everything has failed, it's been 66 years of disaster, they're going to bring paradise because all we created was hell. That is not true. There have been some remarkable changes. And I won't even talk politically and give you examples of things the government has done. Look at the management skills that went into polio eradication. We had the worst polio cases in the world. It cut across all socioeconomic classes. Many of us, not for the recent alums, but for some of the older people here, will remember having classmates who used to wear those braces because they'd been afflicted by polio as a child. I had classmates in my time who had been polio victims. today doesn't exist because we found a solution to eradicate polio using Salk's vaccine, but through managing a nationwide campaign, enlisting NGOs, enlisting civil society, getting people motivated, and creating this extraordinary success. We are establishing research and development labs across the country, which challenging diverse areas now, from housing to healthcare, from transportation to communications. But to do that, to telecommunications, but doing that well requires more capable managers across the board, whether in government or out of government, whether in the private sector, whose influence in our society is growing more and more, or in politics, which I'll come back to later, as we've got this MBA friend of mine to demonstrate. So the main thing is taking the lessons from your ISB education into Indian society. I think Indian management schools, Indian business schools, need to understand, as I'm sure you do at ISB, the way India works, how India's pulse beats. I was struck to hear that cases like the Dabbawalas of Mumbai and the Sulabh International Toilet Campaign, and even Lalu Prasad Yadav's creative accounting at the railways, all of this has been studied at business schools across the world. I mean, this is very important. It suggests to all of you who study business that there is global respectability for how Indian business solutions are working. Relying on Indian practices will help us develop newer models of management. Today, we're increasingly embracing social media in this country. I was amused to see when I hastily looked at my phone as we were about to start, the number of tweets already about this event with the right hashtag already being in use. We are in many ways a country which I think is finding new ways of dealing with our daily lives, new ways of dealing with our challenges, and social media is a technique we've embraced because we are open to new ways. We're changing many of the established management techniques that came down to us in the past, finding indigenous solutions. I mean, the Indian principle of Jugaad, which at one point was all the rage, became a bit controversial because you know what Jugaad is, right? I mean, it's basically finding an improvised solution, usually on the cheap, to solutions. And people started saying, well, this is just cutting corners. This is not really truly innovation. But in fact, we are using this approach of Jugaad to find non-traditional solutions, affordable solutions to perennial problems. And that goes right across the board to the world's cheapest electrocardiogram, which we have invented in India, the world's cheapest insulin injections, the world's cheapest water purifying filters, and so on and so forth, which are all solutions responding to the fact that the needs of the Indian masses cannot be met by the existing inventions, which are unaffordable. And this capacity for thinking out of the box has to grow and must be increased and encouraged. And we can do it all the way. I mean, I'm wearing an example of out-of-the-box thinking I can tell you about. You know, I wear glasses only for distance. Like, I don't need a problem to check my notes. I don't need to wear glasses. I can see the people in the first few rows and recognize friends and others I've met before. But I want to spot anybody at the back, for example. I need to put on a pair of glasses. If I need to drive or see a movie from a seat in the back row, I need to put on glasses, which means that basically I wear glasses 5% of the time. And the rest of the time, I don't know what to do with them because I'm vain enough not to want to wear them all the time, since I only need them for distance. And therefore, what happens usually, I shove them into a pocket, bang into a wall, they break. Or when I'm wearing my Kerala politician's uniform of a munda, dhoti, it has to sit on my lap, it falls off my lap, somebody steps on it, it breaks. Or I just leave it somewhere and forget to pick it up, I lose it. I mean, this happened so much that in fact in the first 3 months of 2013, I actually lost 6 pairs of glasses. So I was lamenting this to a friend. And he said, what's the problem? Why does this keep happening? And the problem very simply is, for 150 years, people have made glasses exactly the same way. They sit on your face, they hang on your ears, and they join in the middle, which means you've got to take them off if you don't want to have them covering your eyes. He said, fair point. That is the only way glasses have been made for 150 years. Let's think about it. And within 2 or 3 months, he came back with a solution. Here it is. If I want to see people at the back, this is all I have to do. Pair of magnets right in the middle, click in place. I can spot you folks. Creative out-of-the-box thinking. Hi to the lady at the back. And then I don't have to worry about losing them because this will hang around my neck the rest of the time. It's a simple example, but these are things that we should be doing much more, thinking beyond the conventional wisdom, thinking out of the box. In fact, it was interesting, 2011, between my two stints in the ministry, I was just an ordinary MP when I was invited by the University of Toronto to inaugurate their India Innovation Center. I thought, wow, a foreign university is recognizing the need to be in on the ground floor on seeing India's innovation as an extremely important development in the world. Now, I don't know how much that center is thriving, but more and more, my good friend Professor Mashelkar has now created an award to recognize, honor, and reward innovations every year, the best Indian innovations he can find. We need to get more into that mindset. We need to encourage. There was a buzzword once of Indovation. It hasn't caught on, but it might yet. And even today, if you Google the phrase frugal innovation, for the last 3-4 years, this has been true. The first 20 hits you get will all relate to Indian examples. We are the land of frugal innovation. We can do it. Now, all of these are of course, challenges for our country as a whole. They're not just political challenges, they're not just business challenges, they're challenges for India. And I would often argue that, in fact, despite the different habitats occupied by politicians and business managers who seem sometimes to be different species, I would argue that the temperament, the intellectual ability, the qualities of endurance and patience, and the creativity that is increasingly required in the successful business leader are entirely the qualities that no self-respecting politician should do without. So we really do have a little more in common than you might otherwise think. Now, you may hear all the time audiences and lectures like this that a new age is upon us, and that this banal and trivial truism that times have changed and so on and so forth. New ages are always dawning, you know, upon the generations that live in them. Every generation speaks of a new age, and by the time you all get closer to my time, you'll be saying that, and then there'll be youngsters listening to you and thinking, my gosh, what is this old person talking about? But one thing that is worth pointing out about the new age that my generation has discovered and lived through in the last 25 years or so, it's been a paradigm shift in some ways that has taken place in the speed of change, and in particular, the changes we've seen in politics and business. As I see it, the salient features of this paradigm shift, and there are so many more. I mean, this is not an academic lecture, so I'm not going to give you a comprehensive list, but a few that I thought I could briefly touch upon today. The spread of globalization, the spread of democracy, and therefore of concern for the poor and social justice, the increasing consciousness of universal ethical standards, both in politics and business, and the mounting emphasis on quality in relation to both process and outcome. So these are the four broad things I'd like to briefly touch upon before I turn to your questions. Now, the first challenge for leaders, and as I said earlier, when I speak of managers, I speak of you as leaders. And I speak of politicians, I know they all want to be leaders. So let's assume that what I'm saying applies to both business people and politicians. The challenge is indeed the challenge of globalization. Because leaders have to be able to grasp what's different about the world in which we live in today. Can I have a bottle of water? Globalization is actually a relatively new term. Professor Theodore Levitt, inevitably a marketing professor at the Harvard Business School, came up with it in 1983 in an article in the Harvard Business Review. No one actually used the word globalization as such before that. But the concept really took off at the end of the Cold War when economic globalization became truly feasible for the first time. And one could argue that the phenomenon had already been a factor in the foreign trade and political relations of countries like the US for a long time, but it's really since then that it really caught on. And of course, now globalization is a word that's become really, really popular in public discourse. In fact, there was a terrible thing that went around the internet around the time of the 10th anniversary of the tragic death of Princess Diana. And if you've heard it before, try not to spoil my punchline. It's about this thing that went around saying, you know, Princess Diana and globalization. You might say, well, what has Princess Diana's death got to do with globalization? Well, here's the answer. An English princess with a Welsh title leaves a French hotel with an Egyptian companion who has supplanted a Pakistani. She gets into a German car with a Dutch engine and is driven by a Belgian chauffeur full of Scottish whiskey. She's then chased by Italian paparazzi on Japanese motorcycles into a Swiss-built tunnel where they crash. A rescue is briefly attempted by an American doctor using Brazilian medicines, and the whole story is being summarized for you today by an Indian MP from Thiruvananthapuram standing in Hyderabad. That's globalization. So it's a term we've now increasingly come to accept in our daily lives, and it's a fact in our headlines, our media, our newspapers, in what you eat, what you wear. Again, very different from my time. When I grew up, you can get pizza in India. Jeans had to be imported or smuggled in. I mean, a lot of things that the younger generation in India has simply just taken for granted. Global products, global foods, vehicles, automobiles, brand names, all sorts of things we didn't have before. And this transformation of India into a truly globalized economy and society is something that has changed in the last generation, in the last 25 years. Globalization is a complex, controversial, and in some ways synergistic process in which improvements in technology, particularly communication, satellite TV, all of that, transportation, combined with the deregulation of markets, more liberalization of trade, more open borders, to bring about vastly expanded flows of people, money, goods, services, and above all, information. So this process, epitomized in some way by the World Wide Web, integrates people, businesses, NGOs, nations into larger networks. And I've argued, for example, in my book, Pax Indica, India and the World of the 21st Century, that we've now gone beyond non-alignment to multi-alignment. Now, that got no traction. But what I meant was, we're living in a networked world now, rather like the World Wide Web is. That is that we have multiple relationships across different networks, some of which overlap with some which overlap with others, don't overlap. And these networks are a more valid way of understanding our place in the world than the binary concept of, say, two opposing superpowers and non-alignment in between. That world is gone. So what do I mean by network? Well, I'll just give you one example, because I don't want to digress too much from my theme. But you've got our foreign minister meeting every year with her counterparts from Russia and China in something called RIC. Then she adds Brazil and South Africa, and she meets in the context of BRICS. Then she subtracts the Russians but retains the Chinese, and she keeps BASIC for environmental negotiations. And then she kicks out both the Russians and the Chinese, and she meets the Brazilians and South Africans in something called IBSA for South-South collaboration. And India is the only member of all four of these groupings, and not merely because our country's name begins with that most useful thing in any acronym, a vowel, but also because these are all valid configurations for us to pursue our interests and where we have a contribution to make to the others, which is why they want us. Now, this is the networked world I'm talking about, and this, at its most benign, promotes convergence, harmonization, efficiency, growth, and even perhaps democratization and homogenization. But globalization has a dark side too. It does produce economic and social dislocations. It arouses public concerns about job security in countries like America during the recession. The popular presumption was when somebody lost a job, it's been Bangalored, right? That was the expression. I've been Bangalored. In fact, 5 million Americans lost their jobs. The whole of India's IT technology industry created 1 million jobs. But every one of the 5 million said that one of those 1 million jobs would have been mine if it hadn't been for India. So there's one consequence of globalization. There's the social consequences, volatility on families, communities, nations. And as modern day leaders, you will have to deal with all of these aspects of globalization, the thorns as well as the roses, right? But my argument is you cannot do so. You must not do so. You should not do so without concern for those below that networked line, those at the bottom of the proverbial pyramid. And I'm going to borrow words from Amartya Sen, who put it better right now than I can. And I quote, "We cannot reverse the economic predicament of the poor," he said, "by withholding from them the great advantages of contemporary technology, the well-established efficiency of international trade and exchange, and the social as well as economic merits of living in an open society. The main issue is how to make good use of the remarkable benefits of economic intercourse and technological progress in a way that pays adequate attention to the interests of the deprived and the underdog. The question is not just whether the poor too gain something from globalization, but whether they get a fair share and a fair opportunity, unquote. And that's a point that I really believe you should all think about. I mean, you know, the assets of the 200 richest people in the world are more than the combined income of 41% of the world's poorest. I mean, that's the gap, the gulf. And as leaders of the 21st century in India, we know that we have comparable figures in India and a large imbalance we need to correct. Whether we grow at 9% as we once did under UPA or 5% as we now do, that was just a cheap shot, you can forgive me. Whether we grow at 9% or at 5% or any other figure that we'll now come to, the truth is we need to be concerned to ensure that the benefits of that growth are experienced by the bottom 25% of our society. Now, another aspect, in a sense it flows from this of leadership in this new age, is one I think you should all focus on, and I hope you focus on at ISB in addition to your regular other studies, and that's a question of ethics in business. Because, of course, ethics has to go beyond the purely legal. If all you learn in an ethics course in a business school is how to avoid falling afoul of the law, that isn't good enough. You have to get a sense of why ethics matters, what the moral underpinnings of it are. But at the same time, no one knows how far beyond the legal ethics should go. No institutionalized rules exist to define an upper limit. Public opinion, as politicians know, is not a very good guide because it's subject to change. How do you as leaders judge what is right and what is wrong? Let me tell you what my own yardstick is. It's a very simple clue that I got from the philosopher Immanuel Kant, who's written about lots of interesting things. And I first read him because he's the one who first postulated the idea of an international liberal order, which in some ways is what the United Nations tries to epitomize. But Kant, writing about ethics and ethical principles, put forward a very simple question. Now, when you're in doubt about something that you might or might not do, ask yourself just one question. What if everyone did that? If everyone did it and you can't accept it, then you shouldn't do it yourself. You can't say, well, it's only me doing it, so it's okay. What if everyone did that? Is, I think, a very, very good yardstick. It often works, perhaps not 100% of the time, but it works often enough to know that at a time of moral dilemmas, you want a compass. It's a very simple compass that no one needs to forget. Indian politics, as you know, has seen more than its fair share of scams and scandals in the recent past. In fact, it also had an economic consequence because the country lost some domestic and foreign investor confidence because of the lack of ethical practices. We need ethical practices as a sort of anti-clogging device in our system to ensure that the system flows properly. Otherwise, like a clogged artery or a clogged pipe in a bathroom, it can burst from the pressure of greed and corruption clogging it. So in a world that's a bit mired in shaky souls and broken promises, people like you who've come out of management schools are going to be leaders in our economy, and as I said, maybe outside our formal companies of the economy, should find in yourselves the will to stick to the right path as leaders of a better India. Increasingly, it seems to me that the right values are going to be more and more indispensable to the kind of educational success that you've had coming out of an institution like ISB. And then the final point I wanted to mention is quality. I mean, quality may be common or uncommon in the Indian industry. You all have different views. It's again, difficult to define. It's something whose presence is, I guess, acknowledged, but whose absence, whose presence is often not acknowledged, but whose absence is always noted because it affects the people who are looking for quality. But then, you know, I often used to joke about India when I spoke about our country to foreign audiences. I'd say, like, anything I can tell you about India, the opposite is also true. And in some ways, that's true of the phenomenon of quality in our country. It's not amenable to easy definition. It can't be pinpointed with too many examples to become invidious. It's rather like pornography. You know it when you see it. You can't define it, but that's what quality is, to my mind. But I would go further. Quality is not merely for a small elite, the top 1% of your graduating class or whatever. It really is something that does and should inhere in all of us. By which I mean that quality is a core aspect of being human. No matter how rich or poor you are, at some point, you've had an aspiration for quality. You want your kid to be the best at something. You want yourself to be the best at something. You can appreciate quality when you're watching a well-played cricket match or eating good food or looking at an excellent painting. The quality of a well-executed stroke is apparent to the aficionado, whether it's a batsman's stroke in cricket or a brush stroke of a painter on a canvas. So quality, there's some sense of quality that we all of us have instinctively. There's a management guru I suspect many of you have read called Philip Crosby, who said that quality is a result of a carefully constructed cultural environment. And he's talking about businesses, so he said it has to be part of the organization, not part of the fabric. And I would argue that this is something that has been part of our system as a nation as well. India needs to have quality in its fabric and in its organizational ethos as well. When you look at things like at the employment of our graduates, the absence of quality hurts employability. I've met so many employers who say that once you get beyond the elite institutions like the ISB, the IIMs, IITs, and so on, that most of the graduates who come out of institutions in India looking for jobs are actually unfit for employment. And there were surveys done by employers' organizations that have confirmed this. So on the one hand, we have a curious oversupply of persons with higher education who are overqualified for the jobs they actually manage to land because their paper qualifications aren't good enough for the jobs they're seeking to get. Something like, Pallam may be able to correct me, I think it's something like 70 or maybe 80% of engineering graduates in our country end up in jobs that don't require an engineering degree. That is, if they get a job at all. So that's one of the reasons why engineering institutions are closing in our country. It's really quite an alarming development. It hasn't happened yet to management institutions, but it may, because there are management institutions, unlike you, that are so bad that many employers would rather hire somebody fresh out of college and train them, educate them, than get them out of a bad management school where they need to unlearn the silly things that they've been taught. Now, this is something which is a problem. And when I speak of quality, therefore, I'm not only referring to the ISBs and the IIMs. I'm saying we need to get quality into these lesser institutions, because the result is that the overall country prospers. I mean, today we saw the end of a cricket match. Those of us who are nuts and woke up early to watch. Yes, we lost, I know, but it was a decent fight nonetheless towards the end. The fact is not that. What I want to talk about is, there was a time when cricket was an elite sport. You had to go to a public school or be very affluent to be able to afford to play cricket, to buy the equipment, to have the leisure to do this. Today, our cricket team is full of people from villages, from small towns, who really learn English after getting picked to play for India, people not from the elite, and who have not only democratized Indian cricket, but added areas of talent and quality and widened the pool from which the team is chosen. That's what we need in management, that's what we need in engineering, that's what we need in business, that's what we need in politics. We need to widen the pool everywhere. We have more people. We just need to get enough quality down into all of them. That is my key message. You know, we talk about leadership. But what is leadership? I mean, the fact is that one story about leadership that I remember from my history reading was of a 19th century French politician. His name is Alexandre Auguste Ledru Rollin. He was the interior minister of the French government formed in the revolution of 1848. And this fellow looked out of his window one day in Paris and saw this mob rushing down the street. And he said, oh my God, I'm their leader, I must follow them. Now, that's one way of looking at leadership, I guess. Except that since that's the only thing for which he is remembered, it may not be the best way of pursuing leadership. Yes, sometimes a good leader needs to be a good follower, but above all, a leader should lead. And the fact is, how do you lead? It's a way, whether in politics or in business or in organizations, of giving people guidance and direction and energizing them to do their own thing better. There's actually a 2,000-year-old Chinese poem about kingship, which says that the worst kind of king is the one who's feared and hated. The next worst, it says, is the one who's admired from afar. The next worst is the king who's loved. So who's the best king of all? The best king of all who is someone who leads his people in such a way that when something is accomplished, the people say, we did it ourselves. That is an old lesson in kingship, but it's also a new lesson in management. If management gets people not only to bring the best out of themselves, but actually to take ownership for the outcomes and the results, and to feel they did it themselves, that, to my mind, is the best kind of leadership. Not the leadership where you take credit and want to shine above others. And I'm not referring to a particular individual, lest you think this is a political speech. The best kind of leadership is the one where the collectivity performs, where you inspire large numbers of people to perform and to feel that they performed not because of you, but because of themselves. If you can do that, you are a great leader. And that, I hope, is something you'll all do. Now, we're living, I'm conscious of the time, and also we live in India where later this week or next week, instead of saying Merry Christmas, we all better say Happy Good Governance Day. But at the same time, good governance is important for the country, and it must become the passion. It must become the passion of future governments. And people like you have come out of a place like ISB can contribute to good governance. It transcends all administrative frontiers. Whether you're talking about infrastructure, whether you're talking about economic growth, it basically comes back to my idea of quality. It means applying quality standards to the basic function of providing services to the public. That's good governance. So if we want quality in all aspects of our life and our society, if all politicians of all parties can recognize the importance of working together for a common goal, if you all in business, in the private sector, can feel the same way, we can actually deliver good governance across our society. And I'm particularly impressed by the quality of the young people that I've had the great privilege of being able to meet and address in audiences like this, in groups like the smaller one I saw in the seminar room a little while ago. The enthusiasm of young people, your energy, your ideas, your curiosity, the questions you ask me, the comments you give, I feel that there will be tremendous, tremendous potential if some of you with your MBA degrees followed Pallam Raju's example and entered politics. Because politics also needs good managers, good leaders in order to deliver good governance. And I know that this is something we could talk about during the brief Q&A that will follow, but I just want to stress that it should not be seen as a world completely alien to the world for which you have prepared yourself with your ISB degree. If you think that you have studied management and that it's only the kind of people who couldn't get into ISB who are in politics, if that's true, it's wrong, because our society needs people like you to also play a role in advancing the public welfare directly and not just indirectly through the companies you run. There's so much more I wanted to say. I'm just very conscious that I've come up with lots of notes, far more than I can really use. And I'm sure you're all worried a little bit about the time. Maybe, can I take a few minutes more? Are we all right? Yeah? You guys getting impatient for dinner or whatever it is that awaits you next? Is there entertainment I'm preventing them from getting? No? All right. So appreciating quality, one of the points I want to make was it also means appreciating and dealing with and living with paradox. And I mean beyond the Indian paradox, when I like to say that, you know, we are an ancient civilization but a young republic, that we have, you know, IT experts who are confidently leading us into the 21st century, while we also have the vast majority of our population living in each of the other 20 centuries. Those paradoxes, I can give you 20 more examples. They're not what I meant. I'll tell you a different paradox. Again, something that I picked up on the internet that some of you may have seen. Not the last Kumbh Mela, but the one before, was this wonderful photograph of a naked sadhu. You know the one I'm talking about? They're absolutely right out of Bollywood central casting, right? Matted grey hair, wispy beard, his skin hanging from his face, wart on his face, broken teeth, Rudraksha mala around his neck, totally bare torso. And in this photograph, this naked sadhu is sitting chatting away on a mobile phone. Now that's India, you see. And if you can expand your imagination to realize you're functioning in a country where this naked Hindu holy man can converse comfortably on a mobile phone, then you've already got to some sense of how exactly you have to cope with the range and immensity of this country. We have fundamental problems that we need to solve, but we can solve them. Indians have done it before. A couple more anecdotes. When Jamshedji Tata was denied admission to a whites-only hotel in Bombay, Pike's Hotel, peak of the British Empire, what did he do? He went and built a bigger, grander, fancier hotel himself, the Taj Mahal. That's today considered one of the finest hotels in the world, and Pike's Hotel has long since closed. Right. And the same Mr. Tata wanted to set up India's first steel mill. What happened? A very senior British official in the Viceroyalty of the day sneered that he would personally eat every ounce of steel that an Indian was capable of producing. Well, I only wish he had lived long enough to see the day when Tatas bought up the remnants of British Steel when they acquired Chorus a few years ago. I might have given him a bad case of indigestion. But the point is that we have to get beyond the stereotypes of who can do what. We have to keep stopping to hold ourselves back by thinking we can't do things. The fact is everyone can do everything. Quality knows no national boundaries, and the smartest executive jets are no longer made in America, they're made by Embraer of Brazil. The tallest building in the world is currently in Dubai, and it overtook the previous tallest building, which was in Taiwan, which overtook one in Malaysia. None of these were the fabled skyscrapers of Manhattan, right? The world's biggest plane is being built in Russia and Ukraine. The world's largest Ferris wheel is in Singapore. The biggest shopping mall, no longer that big one in Minnesota. The world's biggest shopping mall is in Beijing. And the number one two-wheeler manufacturer in the world is not some Italian company, but Bajaj, okay? So the country which is the world's largest consumer of gold, quality gold, right, no debate, 20% of the world's consumption right here, with average consumption demand increasing 13% every year. Now, why am I saying all this? Just to say that whoever is on top today, we can be there tomorrow. And we should have that belief. That belief, because we have done it in some areas, we can do it in all areas. I would argue that, again, the migration of Indians to America proved this over and over again. They got out of the restrictions of our system and they thrived in the most amazing ways, right? So they excelled in the opportunities given there, the atmosphere. And of course, you know that an Indian invented the Pentium chip, another one invented Hotmail, a third one started Sun Microsystems. Indians are involved in 40% of the startups in Silicon Valley in the last 15 years. And to the point where the Indianness of an engineer or a software developer began to be taken as synonymous with quality, with excellence. Americans speak of the IITs now, which they never heard of before the 60s, with the same reverence they used to accord to MIT. And the result, of course, can sometimes mean that as people think beyond the stereotypes, and instead of India as a backward developing country, they think of us as a land that produces computer engineers and geeks. This can have unintended consequences. A friend of mine told me about how at Schiphol Airport in Amsterdam, he was standing innocently in a line, and he was a history major or something, poor fellow. And this perspiring, anxious European approaches him saying, you're Indian, can you help me fix my laptop? So forget the image of Indians lying on beds of nails and sadhus and snake charmers and maharajas on elephants. Now, every one of you, when you go out in the world, has to know how to operate a laptop, fix a mobile phone, log on to the nearest Wi-Fi, as some of the students did for me earlier. But that's great. And the great thing about it is it changes the way people think about us, right? Now, we need the same thing in our politics. I mean, I would argue we need a new political ethos. We need people like you in politics to provide quality leadership, just as we're doing in other areas. We need you to innovate. We need you to inspire, whether you're doing it in a company or whether you're doing it in public life. We need a countrywide commitment to quality that can work across all these areas. And to my mind, there's no question, having spent 6 years in politics, and Pallam has spent much longer, that if you do join politics, we could certainly use you. We could use some good ethical managers to get us going and flourishing. Anyway, I really want to end, but I want to end by saying that, after all, it's very odd for any Indian politician to end a speech without quoting Mahatma Gandhi at least once. So let me live up to your expectations, okay? Gandhiji said it is the quality of our work which will please God and not the quantity. And he also, even more memorably, declared, be the change you wish to see in the world. That really is my closing message to all of you. Quality will not come without change. Both his exhortations apply to all of you in all these fields I've talked about. Change yourselves to change the world, and do so with work and values of the highest quality. I hope you've acquired these at ISB. I hope some of my thoughts have helped stimulate some such yearnings in your own minds. But whatever you do it well, be prepared to change, embrace change with quality, with ethics, with values, with that global perspective I urge you to have. And think of Mahatma Gandhi too when you pursue success in all aspects of your life and work. Congratulations to all of you for what you've been through here, for getting together here. Thank you for having me. Jai Hind.